afternoon, everyone. I'd like to begin today's conversation in a good way by acknowledging that we're gathered today on the traditional, ancestral and unceded territories of the Musqueam people. And to recognise that with our acknowledgement of territory comes responsibilities that are incumbent on us as visitors to this place. These responsibilities include learning about Musqueam culture and traditions in the context of a lecture about English literature and the occult, acknowledging that this place has its own spiritual significance, accompanied by Musqueam stories of the supernatural. It also includes acknowledging that the university's pursuit of knowledge has too often in the past furthered the colonial and settler violence that was visited upon Indigenous people in Canada. Taking the land was only the first of these injustices. The university's role in conceiving and furthering the racist doctrines of eugenics, even as scholars were fascinated by Indigenous practices and beliefs, is another dimension of that colonial violence, about which our speaker, Professor Ferguson, has written. Building good relations with Indigenous communities, particularly with Musqueam, is an important part of our work as a college, and it begins in many ways with truth-telling and acknowledgement of our history and our responsibilities. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Emma Cunliffe. I have the honour of serving as Principal of Green College. It's my very great privilege to introduce the inaugural Patricia Merivale Scholar in Residence to you this afternoon. But before I turn to Professor Ferguson, I would like to speak a bit about our friend Pat Merivale and what she means to us at Green College. I think that for all three of us today, it's something of a full circle moment. I first met Pat over a meal in the Great Hall in the fall of 2002 when I arrived at Green College as a resident member, and Pat was a professor in English and comparative literature. Christine, who was then a postdoctoral fellow, had invited Pat to dinner. My memory of meeting Pat then is of a scholar who was genuinely interested in spending time with graduate students, who treated those she met and spent time with at Green College as intellectual peers who were worth her time, attention and expertise. New to the research world, I warmed to Pat's kindness and her sense of humour immediately, but I didn't fully appreciate at that time how special Pat's career and example really are. A distinguished Professor Emerita, Pat began her illustrious academic career at UBC in 1962, after spending time in residential academic communities in England, the US and Germany. A noted expert on Gothic and fantastic fiction, including metaphysical detective stories, she wrote dozens of articles on a variety of comparative topics. By 1972, she was the only female full professor in what was then UBC's Faculty of English. Pat has actively supported Green College since its inception, and she's a generous donor to UBC. In treating us, the residents of Green College, as worthwhile interlocutors, she was showing us an example of the best of academic traditions, including those that she had absorbed in her own training. More than 20 years after we first met, when Pat and I were discussing her hopes for the Merivale Visitor in Residence Fund, Pat told me that she had two requests for how Green College should put her gift to good use. First, that we would begin using her money immediately, so that she could attend and enjoy the conversations that we would spark. Pat, I'm so pleased to be able to begin fulfilling that promise to you today. Second, that we would use the money to invite visitors who would be generous with their time and expertise, spending time with college residents and offering opportunities for residents and others to interact with them in an environment that would foster collaboration and mentorship and spark new conversations across new generations of scholars. Thank you, Pat, for your wonderful gift, and today let me publicly renew my promise to you that it will make an enormous positive impact for graduate students and residents at Green College and for the university as a whole. When Pat's gift was settled and I turned my mind to inviting an inaugural Merivale Scholar in Residence, I told the academic committee, which normally advises on academic visitors, that I was going to exercise my prerogative as principal to choose the first visitor myself. Professor Christine Ferguson was, for me, the obvious choice. Christine is Chair in English Studies at the University of Stirling in Scotland, where her research focuses on the entwined histories of popular fiction, science, and alternative spirituality in 19th and 20th century Anglo-America. She's the author of 3 books and 2 edited collections, including her latest monograph published by Oxford University Press, Open Secrets, the Popular Fiction of Britain's Occult Revival. A Fellow of the English Association and Royal History Society, Christine's work has made tremendous contributions to our understandings of spiritualism and the occult in 19th and 20th century Anglo-American literature. Christine was a postdoctoral scholar at UBC and a Green College resident from 2002 to 2003, at the time when I was pursuing my Masters in Law. Quite apart from her academic prowess and interdisciplinary contributions, Christine was tremendously generous to me personally. In addition to introducing me to the best Vancouver bars and lending her novels to me at the rate of 2 or 3 a week, it felt like, Christine patiently helped me to work through the theoretical works we were reading in my coursework. She helped me to recognise and work towards meeting the expectations of graduate research, always with a great sense of humour and without ever making me feel smaller for not knowing the things that others sometimes seem to grasp intuitively about graduate work. It's Christine's generosity, as much as her brilliance, her academic achievements and her intellectual lineage with Pat, about which I know she'll speak, that make her the perfect first Merivale scholar. I know that Christine will speak a little to her relationship with Pat, but before I turn the floor over to our speaker, let me observe that what Christine and Pat have in common is deep generosity and love of their chosen subject, coupled with a complete lack of pretension and a kindness towards others. Christine, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you back to Green College as the inaugural Merivale Scholar in Residence. Thank you for accepting our invitation to come home to Ewok Village.
Overwhelmed by that. For a moment, I am so delighted to be here, and I want to start by offering my deepest thanks to Green College, Professor Emma Cunliffe and all the team here. Incredible, most of all, the incredibly generous Professor Patricia Merivale, who's quite established as this visitors in residence scheme that I have the immense privilege of inaugurating this week. It is no exaggeration to say this is the biggest honour of my academic life today. I am profoundly moved. So, as my title indicates, I'm going to be talking tonight about different forms of impossibility. And I'm going to start by the biggest one of all, which is the fact that I am standing here tonight. And that is one that has everything to do with the woman sitting in the front row here. Picture the scene. It is autumn 1994, and I am a young idiot in Toronto. I've got terrible do-it-yourself hairstyle, and I'm wearing those large 90s clothes we used to wear. And I was just about entering my final year as an undergraduate at U of T in English and drama. And I suspect, as with many of you here, that the opportunity to study at university changed my life in every possible way. It opened up intellectual vistas I couldn't have imagined before, and I knew that I wasn't ready to leave academia, but I had no idea how to go about staying. I was from a working class family, a first generation student. I didn't know how to get to that path. So I did what anyone who's a bit feckless did. I just fired off a letter to this really distinguished professor at the other side of the country who I hadn't met. This is before email, of course. The first ever female full professor in her department, and I pitched her this really garbled MA project that I thought I was going to do. It was like, I don't know, like postmodernism, feminism, Jack the Ripper, something like that. No, really, it was. And I asked if she would consider supervising it, and then with incredible kindness and patience, Pat not only replied to my letter, but she agreed to meet me at Trinity College when she was visiting a few weeks later and took me out for dinner, sat me down and helped me forge my kind of incoherent ramblings into a viable and acceptable proposal. And she took me seriously as a scholar long, long before I was ever able to do so myself. Her support enabled me to embark on an MA in English at UBC in the following autumn, where she supervised my dissertation, Ripping Yarns. I'm still really pleased with that title. But also she introduced me to this dazzling panoply of metaphysically inclined writers whose work continues to fuel my imagination to this day. Jorge Luis Borges, Umberto Eco, Paul Auster, Ian Sinclair, and of course Arthur Machen. Pat remains the most valuable, eminent scholar of Pan that we've ever had. Can you imagine encountering all of this at the one time? It blew my mind. It's still blowing my mind to this day, over 3 decades later. And I have to say that my story is just one among countless similar others from so many other students who have been initiated into intellectual life and empowered to pursue their dreams, whether they're inside or outside the academy, through the peerless mentorship of this brilliant woman of letters. It was in recognition of this immeasurable debt that I dedicated my new monograph, Open Secrets, to Pat last autumn, well before I received the invite to speak today. So there was something in the air, the correspondences. My biggest hope is that every early career scholar in this room has the incredible fortune to encounter such a wise, dedicated, good-humoured, and unwaveringly supportive teacher as Pat. And more, that they one day have the same opportunity that I do have tonight to stand up publicly and say how much that has meant to me. So I'm going to go for another round of applause for Pat. Go through that without crying. I wasn't sure I would. Okay, now we're going to turn to a different kind of impossibility that I'm going to spend most of our time talking about tonight. A kind of impossibility that the detective fiction genre, for which Pat has been such a shrewd scholar, supposedly excludes. Now, whether you are dedicated Sherlockians or not, I know we have some dedicated Sherlockians in the audience tonight, you will probably know the most famous deductive maxim associated with Sherlock Holmes and premiered in Arthur Conan Doyle's 1890 novel, The Sign of Four. This is something that's often cited by critics and readers as evidence of the sleuth's rational scientific credentials, these qualities that Conan Doyle supposedly abandoned in his late life dedication to modern spiritualism. Here it is. Say it with me if you know it. How often have I said to you that when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth, right? Is that what detection is? A process of eliminating the impossible. Well, a number of recent scholars, including Sir-John Spyach, Michael Saylor, and Brian McCuskey, have pointed out that despite the supposed rationalism of this statement, Sherlock's empiricism has been wildly overstated in both the criticism of detective fiction and in the popular imagination. Is he really someone who excludes the impossible? Even if we look at the Sign of Four itself, where this very maxim appears, Holmes's deductive conclusions are often far less robust than their quick-fire, scientific framing suggests. Let me give you a few examples. Alcoholism is not the only reason why a gentleman might have scratches on his watch. Men of character, quote, do not always differentiate their long letters, however illegibly they may write. And then some less whimsical and darker forms of scientific presumption in this story. The Hindu proper, whatever that's supposed to mean, Conan Doyle means here, does not have long and thin feet, And most importantly, as Holmes reels off as if it's a fact that everyone knows, Andaman Islanders are not naturally hideous cannibals with large, misshapen heads and distorted features. On closer inspection, these critics argue, Holmes is less of an unerring, calculating machine than a pseudo-scientific essentialist, a magical thinker, or even a conspiracy theorist for whom, Ryan McCuskey writes, reason is actually superfluous. Holmes is a figure whose derision for the conventional police and legal establishment is well known, but the reasons for it are complex. They often derive from the conviction that actually we don't need the police and the courts because there are higher forces in existence able to deliver the totalizing judgment they cannot. And we can see some of these instances where Holmes sort of defers to the metaphysical in various early adventures. From the Boscombe Valley mystery, just listening to that today, where Holmes tells the terminally ill murderer, John Turner, his daughter he wishes to protect from scandal, that he's not going to turn him into the police because, quote, you will soon have to answer for your deed at a higher court than the assizes. The punitive power of Providence also comes into play in the 5 Orange Pips. Oh, sorry, there we go. Where a group of murderous KKK conspirators are drowned aboard the Lone Star before they can be apprehended. And of course, most famously in this ridiculous, is it the most ridiculous Holmes story? Maybe. It's a really strong, red-headedly made strong contender, The Speckled Band, in which, this is seriously the plot if you don't know it, the poisonous snake that the degenerate Anglo-Indian medic Dr. Grimesby Roylott has trained to murder his stepdaughters turns its venom back on him. It bites him. And there's a really fascinating moment in that story when Holmes reflects on the outcome of that the snake turns back on its handler, as if it were inevitable, speaking almost in tones we would expect to come from a contemporary theosophist who's describing the principle of karma. Violence does, in truth, recoil upon the violent, and the schemer falls into the pit which he digs for another. Now, if that were indeed true, there would be no need for the investigative intrusions of a detective. Justice would always just deliver itself without the need of an intentional human agent. No detective fiction either. These sentiments suggest a kind of magical form of criminological wish fulfillment, one that is always perfectly accommodable within, rather than opposed to the scientific ethos that Holmes champions. Holmes describes himself as a scientist. I think the more accurately you might think of him as someone who is a scientistic, right? They use the language of science, but their methods are quite different. Now, to say this, to suggest that Sherlock Holmes might be a bit heterodox, is not to suggest that he's not a secular literary creation. He very much is, but rather to acknowledge that the secularity he represents is not devoid or magical, is not devoid of or liberated from spiritual belief. But rather he represents a secular age where magic and science can combine and fuse. His sleuthing, far from being outside, sometimes Holmes is used as sort of the truest source from which occult detection departs. I don't know if you are fans of occult detective stories. These are brilliant. John Silence, Martin Celius in A Glass Darkly. These are detectives who use magical means, so they're supposedly not like Sherlock. But actually, some of these figures share many of his spiritual impulses and aspirations, even if the Holmes stories typically aren't written in that Gothic register of terror. What I'm suggesting to you, first of all, is that the Holmes stories are always already at home with the impossible. That these are capacious narratives where moral law transcends worldly courts and material objects become, under Holmes's psychometric handling, kind of quasi-animistic fetishes able to reveal the souls of their users. There's something magical about the way that Holmes handles these objects and is able to project the whole suspect just by observing them. Now, I've been making the case for these kind of magical qualities, roots, influences, sources of Holmes' deduction, to connect him to Aleister Crowley, right? To suggest that maybe it was this, because what Holmes is doing is already a form of secular magic, embellished with scientific rhetoric, that this prototype is so appealing, but also so difficult to control for this notorious figure I'm going to talk about now, and I suspect most of you will know. Yes, most of you know Crowley. By one of his many names, the Beast 666, the wickedest man in the world, as he was called in the tabloids, aka the sex magician Aleister Crowley. Right? Now, there's a lot of things people know about Crowley, even if they don't know Crowley, and then there are things that people don't know about Crowley at all. And I'm going to talk about the things that people don't know about Crowley at all, because I think they're really interesting. And that is that aspect is that his fascination and his frequent practice of creative writing and the writing of popular genre fiction. Right? Did you know that Aleister Crowley wrote detective stories? He did, and they're absolutely wild. His scandalous persona and his radical practices have had a far greater impact on his wider reception in popular culture than his extensive cross-genre literary corpus. When he is remembered today, it is primarily as an iconoclastic provocateur who exchanged the puritanism of his rigid Plymouth Brethren upbringing for the hedonistic new religion of Thelema he spearheaded after its central tenets, published here in the Book of the Law in 1909, were allegedly announced to him by the otherworldly messenger Iwas in Cairo in 1904. He's known as a pioneering magical practitioner who drew upon tantric traditions and entheogenic traditions to insist that the best way to liberate ourselves spiritually is not to repress or deny the body, but actually to move through it and to move through physical pleasure. And also as the controversial leader of the short-lived Abbey of Thelema community in Sheffield, which would dramatically close down in 1923 after the death there of his follower Raoul Loveday under allegedly suspicious circumstances. Loveday died of almost definitely typhoid, but it was suspected at the time he'd been poisoned. This happens, and then Crowley is expelled from Italy by Benito Mussolini. So to be expelled from a country by Benito Mussolini, you have to be doing something quite extreme. These are the parts of Crowley we know, right? This is what we know about him. But almost never is he recognised as the dedicated, knowledgeable and innovative writer and reader of detective fiction that he was. Qualities that would drive his creation in the final years of the First World War, of the first, and I think still only ever, fictional Thelemic sleuth, Simon If. Here he is, appearing on a page of the International. You can read about him, or Tolstoy, or Sinn Féin, or 1066. It's a really eclectic offering there. So, where does If come from? What's his context? Well, when he debuted in the US-based pro-German periodical The International that Crowley edited from August 1917 to April 1918, If was billed, this is Crowley's own advert for his creation, typically modest, as the greatest sensation since Sherlock Holmes, an entirely original character whose method of detection is the most fascinating in all literature. Wow, right? 6 If stories appear in the paper between September 1917 and February 1918, and they're all badged under the series heading The Scrutinies of Simon If. It's a really fascinating counterpart to the adventures of Sherlock Holmes, Holmes' Adventures, If Scrutinizes. And Crowley didn't sign them. He used his pseudonym, which is Edward Kelly, the same name that he'd taken from the magical partner of the great Renaissance magus, Dr. John Dee. Now, If never achieved the fame that his creator wanted for him. If he did, we would all know who Simon If was. But what he did do was really captivate Crowley, and we find Crowley compulsively returning to this figure again and again in the years after 1917. He features as the presiding millenarian magus in this war thriller, occult roman à clef, The Butterfly Net, that's written in 1917, and then it's published as Moonchild in 1929. And then he appears in these 3 new short story sequences, Simon If in America, Simon If Abroad, and Simon If Psychoanalysis. That's an interesting one. None of which saw print during their author's lifetime. Right? And indeed, there would be no republication of the original international If stories until 1987, when Martin P. Starr, this is his edition here, edited a single volume version of the Scrutinies for Titan Press. All 4 of the If collections were only published together, and the last 3, this is the very first time, in William Breeze's 2012 edition of the Simon If Stories and Other Works for Wordsworth Press. It's really interesting that they're part of a series on tales of the mystery and supernatural, which I think really elevates their genre coordinates and focalizes them on works of creative fiction rather than as religious texts. Why am I telling you about this weird publication history? Well, I think it contributes to the obscurity into which these tales have fallen. And it's part of the reason why they've rarely been read at all outside dedicated Thelemite circles. And when they have been, the stories are often taken as no more than kind of like clumsy biographical ciphers, right? Because Crowley he's a man who likes to settle personal debts in his fiction, so a lot of it is like ex-lovers, people that, you can read them for that, it is there, but the stories are so much more than these kind of coded diary entries, right? They deserve to be recognized as more than a footnote to occult historiography. And in this next part of my talk, through analysis of the very first If story, The Big Game, I'm going to argue for them as potent and really meaningful stages within detective fiction's evolving relationship with the impossible. And in this context of impossibility, what I'm talking about are fringe, avant-garde, or recrudescent spiritual beliefs in our secular age. I'm going to be talking about Big Game, but first a little bit more about Crowleyan detective fiction. And it's a really interesting, what would we say, it's a lifelong relationship, is one way to describe it. Although sometimes trivialized by Crowley scholars and Thelemite practitioners who are really more interested in the beast's revealed religious writings than his commercial fiction, the If stories were no flash on the pan. In the contrary, they were the product of a long genre apprenticeship in detective fiction. As his one-time secretary and fellow occult practitioner Israel Regardi observed, Crowley was an inveterate reader and connoisseur of detective stories. His passion for the genre triggering some of his earliest acts of insubordination against the religious restraints of his repressive religious upbringing. And there's this great story in his autobiography here, The Confessions of Aleister Crowley, with Crowley's own cover illustration from it, where he talks about what it meant to be growing up as a young boy who loved to read in a really evangelical household, right, where there were extreme controls over what he could have access to. He says, I was absolutely cut off from literature. 1 or 2 books of Scott and Dickens were permitted. Ballantyne was approved. G.A. Henty Wintack rather than openly tolerated. It's a pretty small collection. I'm really intrigued by which of the Dickens were allowed. I don't know. Maybe Greg, no, probably not Greg. Anyway, nonetheless, right, never someone to obey orders, the young Crowley defiantly smuggled illicit titles into the house to read furtively in the family water closet. And fascinatingly, the book that he talks about in the confession as doing this with is this one, Fergus Hume's The Mystery of a Hansom Cab, this phenomenally popular Australian detective novel that outperformed Conan Doyle's A Study in Scarlet when it was published in Britain in 1887. he recalled, "My mother considered the hansom cab as an engine devised by the devil, and any reference to one was considered obscene." Wow. Not surprising he turned out how he did, eh? For me at least, there's something undeniably pleasing in this image of a young Crowley squatting over a toilet while voraciously consuming a ripping bestseller whose genre and ultra-modern subject had been deemed verboten within his evangelical household. It seems to me to really sum up this, to combine and anticipate his future interests in fiction, in filth, and in pleasurable rebellion. Detective fiction, as this story suggests, appealed to Crowley's revolutionary imagination, first as a subject of prohibition, and hence as a powerful vehicle, like the cab itself, for transgression. It's not surprising then that references to classic works of detective fiction, whether these be from Wilkie Collins or Conan Doyle, other writers, pervade all of the Confessions and indeed Crowley's wider literary oeuvre. He's obviously someone who's really intimate with literary detection, and his fascination with its potentially subversive capital rendered it a really important staging ground for his interwar reckoning with the explosive tension between, but it's also within, two different theories of law, two different systems of law, right? The first system of law, the secular law system that detective fiction normally fulfills, right? Traditionally serves. It's about catching criminals, right, and punishing them in some ways. And then the other Thelemic law, right? The law of absolute self-liberation associated and promoted via Iwas, the messenger, central to this new religion of Thelema, which often comes into, as we're about to see, into direct clash with that secular form of law. This contest between these two systems of law, right? The first one, which is concerned with all the usual things, police and courts, the preservation of personal property and rights, and the other one mandating the imperative to be true to oneself above all else, takes center stage in this insane story I'm about to tell you about now, from 1917, The Big Game. It was published in September 1917, and this is a little side note, but you know, I love interesting little side notes. September 1917, this is when Crowley publishes his first detective story. It's the same month that Conan Doyle would close his fourth tranche of Sherlockian stories, The Strand, with his last bow, right? And Doyle is finishing up then because he's going to take time off and he's going to commit himself full-time to spiritualist crusading for the next 4 years, right? This is fascinating as a historical coincidence. At the same time that Britain's most celebrated detective fiction is trading in fictional sleuthings for the seance room, and devoting himself to the new religious cause, the country's most famous ceremonial magician is turning to literary detection, right? The fact that that's happening at all suggests the rich two-way traffic and the mutual affordances of spiritual and popular fictional modes of seekership in this early period. Now on to Big Game. And, well, not there yet. The first thing to say about this is it's impossible. It's an impossible story. Ridiculous to a point that stretches beyond parody into a dizzying destabilization of the competing ethical and philosophical systems on which it seems to be founded. And it is this sort of the chaos of the story that causes me to disagree with some of the new religious scholars who've written about this story. There's not many of them, but when they do, their argument often goes something like this. They're like, oh, you know, Crowley's got this new religion, he's trying to find new followers, he's trying to teach the lessons in a really accessible way, so he just turns to these detective stories, and if you just read them, they offer these little lessons about how to be a good Thelemite, right, what it means. Here's an example of this kind of argument from Martin P. Starr. He says, as will be noted by readers familiar with Crowley's philosophy, he managed to incorporate subtly the principles of the law of Thelema to an astonishing degree, demonstrating that they are the basis of rational human conduct and how the neglect of them in turn leads to crime and unhappiness. This is absolute nonsense. For various reasons. First of all, the word subtle and these stories don't belong in the same together. There is nothing subtle about them. And they do invoke the laws of Thelema, but often simply to complicate and collapse them. Right? Let me tell you about the story, and I know it's difficult to hear someone talking about something you've not read, so I've made this handy chart of you. Try and keep to that. I'll tell you about the setup. So in the opening, we've got these two successful urban professionals celebrating together. We've got the criminal lawyer, Dick Fuchs, and yes, if you're wondering if that's a pornographic pun, it absolutely is. Crowley, didn't sleep on that one. And the leading journalist, Jack Flynn, and they are celebrating. What are they celebrating? Together, their combined efforts to acquit this guy, Ezra Robinson, from the charge of having murdered his employer, Richard Marsden, in this very strange locked room stratagem. How did they do this? Well, Fuchs had punched holes in the circumstantial evidence and convinced jurors that Marsden had... this is actually in the story. They had convinced him that Marsden had accidentally stabbed himself while knife juggling in the bath during a power cut. We've all been there. It's boring without the power on. And so that's what Fuchs does, and then Flynn comes in, he helps his colleague, also as the narrative implies, they might be lovers, by writing long articles on the miscarriage of justice, others on the weaknesses of circumstantial evidence, where no strong motive was evident, others again in strange accidental death. But this victory, this is what they're celebrating, it's no triumph for the law. As Fuchs casually admits to Flynn, Robinson was absolutely guilty. He knew it. He had spontaneously plotted and carried off this murder of poor Richard Marsden with his lover Maud Duval, who's described as a fellow cocaine addict and member of, quote, some kind of devil-worshipping club. Right? So they have perverted the law, and they're delighted with this, right? And they are so happy with getting away with it that they plan further illicit amusements, specifically the big game of the title. What is their big game? Well, they dare each other that within the next 12 months, they are going to each commit a completely motiveless murder, right? That is pursued purely out of adventurous nature, not for greed or animosity. You can't get anything out of it. It has to be random and just for fun. And pursued, here we go, simply for the joy of baffling the stupid police, fooling the detectives with false clues, triumphantly proving yourself innocent when you know you are guilty. So they each choose their victim. They're related to the original cast here. Fuchs chooses the sister of the original victim, Marsden. She's actually married the murderer on his release from jail. He bludgeons her to death on the anniversary of her brother's murder, knowing that this odd coincidence will provoke, quote, the clever novelists to fabricate, novelist detectives to fabricate a mystery of revenge in connection with the date. I think this is a really nice metafictional allusion in this story, which shows Crowley winking at and playing with the conventions of the genres, and kind of saying to his readers, like, I know you have a predilection for pattern seeking, you're going to try and anticipate where this is going, it's not going to work here, right? Yes, Fuchs kills Mrs. Robinson, and Jack Flynn goes to Paris on the same date, where Robinson and Maud are meeting covertly to celebrate their crime. Now there, in the guise of a rouged-up homosexual cocaine peddler, he lures the drug-addled pair back to their rooms, in which they are later found dead by hanging. Right? So they both pull it off. They both get their big game. They fulfill effortlessly this bet. Now, if you've made it this far in the story, or indeed in my talk, you've been promised, if readers have been promised the greatest sensation since Sherlock Holmes, might well throw their hands up in despair, right? Where's the detective, for one? It's supposed to be a detective story. What's going on? But also, where is the judgment and the ensuing punishment for criminal transgression that Holmes always pronounced, even if he sometimes let Providence take care of it? Moreover, where are the magical tools and the numinous manifestations so central to the adjacent genre of occult detection that readers might have expected they were going to be reading this if they were reading, a story by a well-known sex magician, right? There's going to be a bit of magic in here. But in fact, nothing supernatural happens in this story, or indeed most of the scrutinies. Instead, and almost too late to fulfill the contract of the genre, like just a couple of pages before the end, the detective enters, right? Simon appears running into Fuchs at the Hemlock Club and playing a few games of chess with him. As many critics have pointed, If is basically a self-portrait of how Crowley would like to imagine that he would be in old age, right? Wise, learned, universally suspected, kind of wry, nothing bothering him, unlike the real Crowley. He's a little old man. A little old man who was known as a mathematician of great eminence with a touch of the crank. And he effortlessly wins each of these chess games, not, as he explains, because he's a better chess player, that's not important, but because he has a deeper psychological understanding. He says, I can gauge your intellect to Fuchs. It is limited in certain directions. Indeed, if surmises to Fuchs, it is exactly such a mind, basically a mind that is too narcissistic to realise its own limitations, that could have committed the recent murder of old Mrs. Robinson without realising the vulnerabilities this act would incur. The murderer had put himself in checkmate to another criminal player. There may be someone hunting him who is as superior intellectually to him as he is to the police, if casually remarks, careful not to directly accuse Fuchs of the murder. He would have no experience in his own person that such monsters as himself were at large. Therefore I ask you, how does he know every night that someone might not kill him in his sleep? Of course, this is an excellent example of a magical suggestion, and it works like poison. Within a month, Fuchs has descended into this full-blown paranoia that necessitates his incarceration within a mental institution from which he's unlikely to ever be discharged. Right? Okay, so let's say the story had ended there. Fine. We might see this as maybe a slightly more lurid version of an Agatha Christie story, but similar in the same kind of satisfying moral arc of the Golden Age detective story. Right? There's a crime, the criminal is caught and brought to justice. In this case, they're incarcerated. This is one of these stories in which criminal actions, again, never escape detection. Wouldn't it be a nice fantasy world to live in? And in fact, if it does make that point in the story's conclusion, somberly declaring, we are all punished, we are all punished exactly where we have offended, and in the measure thereof. But the interesting thing is who he's saying this to, right? He's not saying this to poor Mad Fuchs in the asylum for his life. He's saying this to the story's other murderer, Jack Flynn, whose own act of killing two people, and whose complicity in the false exoneration of Marsden's killer, is instantly absolved and almost without comment after the journalist confesses it. This is what If says. Rather, he doesn't give him a magical suggestion. He says, you have perhaps erred in some ways which I find excusable, but you need never lose a night's sleep over the business. Not only does Flynn not lose a night's sleep over the murder of 3 people, he seems to be rewarded for his homicidal actions by becoming a de facto initiate of the secret esoteric brotherhood that If heads, appearing in later tales like The Conduct of John Briggs and Not Good Enough, as a kind of magical Watson to the occult master. He will be the one who will explain Thelema to others. What are we to make of the drastically different fates of the two murderous co-conspirators in the big game? Why does F find Flynn's actions more excusable than Fuchs's from a Thelemic point of view? If punishment is really calibrated in relation to the nature of offences, then doesn't the fact that Flynn seems to benefit from his crime, retaining his position at the top of his profession and gaining access to his hidden wisdom, suggest that he hasn't offended at all? Evoked but never adequately answered in the big game, these questions prevent any sense of narrative fulfillment or moral satisfaction that we might expect from the solution to such a really bizarre murder. Ultimately, the big game becomes impossible. And I mean impossible either as a kind of like didactic text that the new religionists would claim for it, where it's like just teaching these particular spiritual laws, but also impossible as a well-plotted piece of genre writing because it's trying to fulfill two contrasting, mutually exclusive understandings of legality at the same time. Now, the first of these systems derives from the very individualistic theory of salvation laid out for Thelema in this book, the Book of the Law that I referred to earlier. This is a channel text produced in 1904. Even if you don't know the Book of the Law, if you've not read all of the Book of the Law, you'll probably have heard its three most famous maxims at some point. Certainly the first one, right? These are supposed to like sum up in total all of Thelema's teachings. First, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Love is the law, law under will, and there is no law beyond do what thou wilt. Okay, so what do these mean? Maybe some of the most misinterpreted spiritual tenets in history. As Crowley would frequently insist, these directives weren't to be interpreted as endorsements of an erratic, impulsive, or undisciplined hedonism. This isn't about just like do whatever the hell you feel like no matter what, right? On the contrary, for Crowley, they demanded that as everyone and all of us as individuals, we take seriously this project to study ourselves really closely, try and find out what our true will is, and then do nothing but that. And by true will, it's really talking about, I suppose we can understand that as being, the purpose, as Richard Kaczynski points out, to which they must devote themselves to the exclusion of all else. So, do what thou wilt shall be all of law doesn't mean do whatever the hell you want, no matter what. So it's not an incitement to criminality in that way. However, should one's true will, if you really have examined it carefully, and you've spent a lot of time on this, should it require the commission of acts that are usually called criminal? The Book of the Law makes no insistence that we resist that, right? And indeed, in his later commentaries on the work, Crowley demonstrates a really deeply unsettling tolerance for certain criminal transgressions, particularly those relating to sexual assault and murder. I'll give you an example. This is slightly disturbing, but it's important for you to see so you know what I'm talking about. This is the collection of his commentaries on the text that he wrote in the 1920s and 19-teens, and then published as the Book of the Law. And here he suggests physical constraint up to a certain point is not so seriously wrong. Some of the most passionate and permanent attachments have begun with rape. Rome was actually founded thereon. Similarly, murder of a faithful partner is ethically excusable in a certain sense, for there may be some stars whose nature is extreme violence. It's that final sentence I really want to focus on, this idea that every man and woman is a star, and some stars require violence, right? Now, after he writes this in the Laws for All, Crowley kind of backtracks a little bit, and he goes, well, maybe these sentiments might just be my personal view. But he then comes back and he defensively affirms, Yet nature's unspeakable variety, though it admits cruelty and selfishness, offers us no examples of the Puritan and the prig. Now, for me, that qualification makes the original sentiment even worse, right? Because it seems to be suggesting that, okay, rape and murder are wrong, but at least they have the virtue of being natural, right? While Puritans and prigs, and I guess by these terms he's talking about people who might disapprove of murder and rape, do not, right? Now, obviously, for obvious reasons, Crowley would have presented a very different version of Thelema when he was talking about it in the public sphere, or indeed when he was in court. And he was compelled to defend his philosophy from charges that it incited crime in the name of black magic. Let me give you an example. So, there's a famous trial in the early 1930s. This woman, Nina Hamnet, who's an amazing Welsh artist, she'd spent some time at the Chefaloo colony, and she wrote about it in her memoir here, Laughing Torso, which I recommend to you all. Crowley thought it was libelous, so really foolishly decided to sue her. He accused her of saying that what he was doing was black magic, and his defense on that, sorry, go back to that, was no, it's absolutely no. I mean, black magic is not only foul and abominable, but for the most part, criminal. To begin with, the basis of all black magic is that utter stupidity of selfishness which cares nothing for the rights of other people. In many cases, black magic is an attempt to commit crime without incurring the penalties of the law. Interesting. Which law are you talking about here, Crowley? The almost main instrument of black magic is murder, either for inheritance or for some other purpose or in some way to gain personally out of it. This is a very different sentiment than their stum stars whose nature is extreme violence, right? So here, in places like this, Crowley seems very much to be aligning himself with that second, more conventional, juridical type of legality evoked within big game, and indeed within most forms of traditional detective fiction, which considers violations of individuals' rights to be punishable, whether or not they are fulfilling the true will of their perpetrators. Now, it's not my intention to try and reconcile these starkly opposed positions within Crowley's thought. And I'm not even going to suggest that one of them was more truly felt than the other, like, you know, one's the real one and one's like a sensational or sanitizing front. Better scholars than me have tried to do that and failed, so I won't do that here. What I want to point out that is in the big game, and indeed so many of the later If stories, neither system of law is given the last word. Both are compromised by a tortured narrative logic. How do we read this mess of a story? If we try and read it as a story that's going to try and, you know, teach us about Thelema and illustrate a Thelemite tolerance or even encouragement of criminality as something that is necessary for some people, why is the libidinally named Dick Fuchs a natural-born killer, if ever there was one? Why is he punished for his transgressions? Surely he is. That is his star. Why is Flynn, a more prolific but ultimately much more dilettantish murderer, left free to pursue a course of personal spiritual liberation in the top tiers of London clubland? And the same questions persist if we decide we're going to read it the other way and say, no, actually, these are conventional stories that bear out what Crowley would sometimes say at different times about Thelema, which was, public would say, you know what, far from inciting violence, if we all just do what we will, there'll be no crime, right? There'll be no war. This is a religion of peace, despite the Eon of Horus or whatever, right? That Thelema is going to be a solution to criminal violence. But if the infringement of human rights truly is inimical to Thelema, a spiritual system who, as I said, the beast had insisted would end all human conflicts, why do its principles here seem to both reward murder and to position it as a form of entry into higher wisdom? Now, perhaps it is in the very evocation of these unanswered questions that Aleister Crowley, this scandalous, salacious magus, comes closest to his counterpart, Conan Doyle, the conservative Christian spiritualist, right, whose sentimental chivalry and nostalgic imperialism were coming to seem distinctly old-fashioned, even, dare I say, Victorian in the post-war period. We don't often think about these two men together, but I think we really should. And it's not just the September 1917 thing either. Both Doyle and Crowley recognised the spiritual potency behind the empirical and rational facade of classical and golden age detective fiction. Both would also, at different points in their career, attempt to synthesize through this genre in particular, right? Of all the ones you could choose, it could be horror fiction, romance, whatever. They choose detective fiction to try and synthesize the scientific and religious credentials they wanted for their new heterodox belief systems. I'll give you an example of some of that rhetoric in both of their parts. So here, this is the text in which Conan Doyle comes out as a spiritualist, right? He first announces he's a spiritualist in 1916, and then this book comes along shortly thereafterwards, and he defends his beliefs on the basis of saying, look, this isn't a throwback, this isn't a descent into the spirit. Actually, this is a really scientific belief. He had argued that one of the greatest potencies of Christian spiritualism lay in its promise to unite reason and faith, and to produce a creed which might unite the churches and be reconciled to science, and thus end a nightmare from our minds. It's a big promise, right? These words echo the ambition of a young Aleister Crowley just a decade earlier, who, when setting up the Equinox periodical that he edited for the AA Magical Order, gave it this subtitle, The Method of Science, the Aim of Religion. I think that would be a great sort of motto for Conan Doyle and Crowley's detective stories, right? Aligned in their ambition as synthesizers of science and new religion, Conan Doyle and Crowley each wrestled chaotically with the task of layering spiritual law onto the structures of popular fiction. With Crowley's efforts in this direction all too often, as we've heard a bit tonight, falling into this kind of nonsensical fever dream. But through this very impossibility, the if stories demonstrate the often under-reckoned role of detective fiction, no less than of horror fiction, as a site to reckon with, to resist, or simply exploit the liberatory potential of unorthodox spiritual belief in a secular age, which is multiplying the ways in which we might imagine and implot the unseen world. Thanks very much, everyone.